How we doing, Penn State football fans? Johnny McGonigal checking in for a different episode of the Blue White Breakdown presented by Penn Live. Big Ten title week. Penn State, Oregon, heading out for the Big Ten championship game in Indianapolis at Lucas Oil Stadium on Saturday at 8 o'clock. It's a game that we've talked about it over the last couple of days now. A game that many did not expect Penn State to be in. Got some help in the final weekend of the regular season with Ohio State. Shockingly, stunningly getting upset in the game by Michigan, by their heated rival in that noon slate. And then Penn State knew going in to their 3:30 game against Maryland that they were going to have a chance to play for the Big Ten championship if they beat the Terps, thanks to breaking some tiebreakers with Indiana, and Penn State got it done. So we thought that it would be fun to do a little subscriber mailbag podcast. It's just me today, solo session, solo mission. Me and Max already talked about some implications around the Big Ten title game with a podcast that we recorded on Sunday. Me and Bob will be back later this week to preview the game in depth. And then Max and Bob will also be recording a podcast later this week after signing day, which that is still going on. That's still a thing. On Wednesday, Penn State will ink, I would assume the vast majority, if not all, of their 2025 commits on signing day. So plenty of podcasts in your feed this week, but me and Max, we've had a lot of fun this year talking to you guys, fielding your questions and giving our thoughts and opinions and sometimes some cold hard facts. And figured we would do this this week and just field some questions and go from there and have a one-way discussion, but and have some fun with it. But first question we've got, it's an interesting one actually from Matt. First of all, asking if Penn State is in their home and away uniforms. And that's something that I was curious about too. And I started doing some digging. Couldn't find anything, with it being the first time that, in a while. I guess first time in forever that Penn State has had a Big Ten championship game without divisions. At first it was Legends Leaders, and then for the longest time East-West. And I know that the East-West alternated year by year, who was home and who was away. I'm not sure how they're going to handle that. So, maybe I'll reach out to the Big Ten, reach out to Penn State. They're probably holding maybe a little announcement or, a little video of like revealing the uniforms and stuff. So not sure right now if Penn State's going to be in their home blue and white or their road whites. But another question from Matt, who asks questions a lot to us and much appreciated. Any injury concerns for Oregon? We know the injury concerns for Penn State. And yes and no. Something to keep in mind there. Really, it's three guys that I'm keeping an eye on. Tez Johnson, Oregon's star wide receiver, leads a team with 9 touchdown catches, future NFL player. I mean, he's very, very good. He returned after missing the previous 2 games and had a touchdown against Washington in their regular season finale at home. Oregon coach Dan Lanning said, that he could have been back earlier, sooner if needed, and that as soon as he went down with the injury that he had, he wanted to play. So I would fully expect Tez Johnson, one of 2 dynamic receivers Oregon has, along with Evan Stewart, to be playing in this game and to be challenging Penn State's corners and secondary and providing an outlet for Dylan Gabriel. On the other side of the ball, another guy who I expect to go and had some lingering injury issues, not just last week, but in previous weeks, was Jordan Birch, one of their 2 star edge rushers. Him and Uyunglele have combined for 20 combined sacks, I believe, and they've been 20 total sacks between those 2 guys. They've been on a tear. But Jordan Birch, he missed 3 games in October. Missed the penultimate game of the season against Wisconsin, and then came back against Washington and had 2.5 tackles for loss. So I think he's going to be just fine unless he picks up something in practice, something that we'll be keeping an ear on, obviously. But Jordan Birch, one of their best players defensively, will be playing as I would expect in this game on Saturday. One that is up in the air is Marcus Harper. It's a name that if you've just seen Oregon play a handful of times, the name wouldn't ring a bell. But he's one of their starting guards. He got injured against Michigan missed the last 3 games. I believe he was questionable for the game against Washington, their final game of the regular season. Dan Lanning said at some point in recent weeks that they would get him back this season. And he coupled him with Tez Johnson. We know Tez Johnson played against the Huskies. Harper did not. Something to keep an eye on if they have to go to a number 2 guard on the interior of their offensive line. We got a question from Carol. The early lines have just been better than a field goal of separation between these two teams. Is this matchup really that close? She also mentioned that in the past, there was always a big discrepancy, big difference between the East and West teams. That seemingly was always the case when Penn State played a really close game against Wisconsin back in 2016, but it seemed like whenever Ohio State or recently Michigan went out to Indianapolis, they just put on a show against Iowa or whoever else made it out of the West. She asked if this matchup, is it really that close? And yeah, it is. I mean, right now, the line, I saw it opened at Oregon favored by 3.5 points. That went up to 4.5 pretty quickly on Saturday night. I haven't checked to see where it's at now, but I wouldn't be surprised, honestly, if it finished around 6 or 5.5. Early money coming in on Oregon. But this is something that another subscriber brought up to me actually as well, is that ESPN's Football Power Index, their predictive metrics, give Penn State a slight edge in this game, 51% chance to beat Oregon. So ESPN and their predictive measures kind of couch this as a coin flip. So it is incredibly tight. I haven't made my game prediction yet, but I would expect it to go down the wire one way or the other. Keep an eye out. We'll be having our game predictions, as we always do, our staff predictions, me, Bob Flounders, Max Ralph, and our incredible photographer, Joe Hermit. Will be publishing our picks on Penn Live on Thursday morning. Another question. I'm sorry. You know what? Yeah, no, that was from Carol. Okay. All right. I'm getting mixed up here. All good. Got a couple of thoughts from Andrew. This looks like a defensive battle. I agree. Wisconsin did a good job of slowing their offense. A West Coast team making a long trip. Nittany Nation will travel well and be loud. Hope we can hold together our injury-depleted offensive line. Aller and Warren are a lethal duo. Carter and our defensive ends will make their quarterback Curry. I see a close game that we can win. A lot of thoughts there. Let's just dive into them, giving me an avenue to talk about a few different things here. First of all, I wrote about Abdul Carter up online on Penn Live Tuesday morning. We talked to Dylan Gabriel and a couple of other players from Oregon. They're very aware of the challenge that Abdul Carter presents off the edge. Abdul is sitting at 19.5 tackles for loss, 10 sacks, has been on a tear with 10 TFLs in his last 5 games, playing like the projected first-round pick. That not even just first round, but we're talking like top 5, top 10 pick come April for Abdul Carter. Since making the switch from linebacker to defensive end, he's kept that power, that speed, that rare explosiveness and burst. But you can see over the last month and a half, him to continue to develop those techniques and fine tune, not just the natural innate ability to get to the quarterback, which he's kept, but also to do it in a smart way, to play the run, to ID screens, et cetera, et cetera. He's gotten better in that area, and I think he can be. I mean, it's kind of easy, kind of simple. Abdul Carter can be a key in this game. And I think it would be a huge stage for him to show up again and continue his hot run of form. On the flip side, the other quarterback, Drew Aller and Tyler Warren, obviously those two have been a dynamic duo. Tyler Warren has just been getting open in a multitude of fashions, whether he's as a running back, a tight end, a receiver, a quarterback. Putting defenses in conflict, and I would fully expect Andy Kotelnicki to try to do that again to Oregon's defense. But talking about it, I see this, though, the same way that Andrew sees it, in that it could be a defensive battle. I'm not sure. You mentioned the travel with Oregon. I'm not sure if that's really going to matter a whole lot. They should be well rested because they had a bye. It was kind of an oddly timed bye, but they had a bye before their final game against Washington. So it's a long season, but as much as a team can be well rested, in early December after a grueling Big Ten slate. You would think that Oregon would be. But yeah, Wisconsin did a great job against Oregon, gave them a real run for their money. Oregon undefeated, but that was the game that it looked like if they were going to drop one, it was going to be Camp Randall Stadium. And something that stood out to me in watching that game, live, picking up a good bit of it, and then going back and watching it as well. Wisconsin did a phenomenal job in the red zone against Oregon specifically. They held them to field goal attempts. They picked off Dylan Gabriel. Not the first time Dylan Gabriel has made some red zone mistakes this season. And I think that's an area where Penn State, could have an advantage. I mean, you look at Penn State's touchdown conversion rate allowed in the red zone. So the number of times that other offenses are getting in the red zone against Penn State, the percentage of time that they're scoring touchdowns on those trips and not settling for field goals or nothing, Penn State ranks second in the country. I think they're second behind Ohio State, which, we know how the Ohio State-Penn State goal line situation went. So not necessarily a surprise that Ohio State did a good job there too. But Penn State's defense has been great in the red zone this year. And I think that you talk bend, don't break, and what Tom Allen has brought to this unit this year in his first year as a defensive coordinator. It gets tough. It gets tough down there in closed spaces against Abdul Carter, Denai Dennis Sutton, Zane Durant causing problems on the interior. Super athletic secondary that Penn State has, very deep, very versatile. You have to account for Jalen Reed blitzing off the edge. You have to account for Tony Rojas and Kobe King at linebacker. When they're playing their best, they're really good. And I think that Penn State's defense would be okay ultimately with making Dylan Gabriel and the Ducks just drive down the field and then beat them in the red zone. Like I think that's a matchup to watch in this game upcoming. But one thing, that he also mentioned the injury depleted offensive line that Penn State has. And, more specifically, Anthony Donko at right tackle dealing with a long-term injury. He suffered just a couple weeks back, and Nolan Rucci now, the Wisconsin transfer, former Warwick standout, former 5-star guy, filling in at right tackle. We talk about the red zone being an advantage for Penn State. I think that could be an advantage for Oregon. I mentioned their dynamic duo off the edge in Jordan Birch and Uyunglele, the better Uyunglele. Going up against Penn State's tackles, like Drew Shelton, has been solid on the blind side, but not as he hasn't been spectacular. He hasn't been Olu level. He's been good and reliable, but Nolan Rucci, like James Franklin said it a couple weeks ago. He couched it by saying Rucci and the entire offensive line, but he was asked specifically about Rucci and said, there are 20 snaps where you feel phenomenal about how they're playing, and then there's a few that are disappointing or less than impressive. And I think more specifically that comes in pass protection with Nolan Rucci at right tackle. And so I think Penn State might miss Anthony Donko there on the right side, considering the talent that Oregon has on its defensive front. That was a long one, but I appreciate Andrew just giving me an opportunity to break down a couple of things here in this game. We've got a couple more. We got Brian G, who called himself Mr. Hopeful, by the way, in this response. So I already love it. Let's just read what he's got. All we hear about are the what ifs right now. What if Penn State loses to Oregon? What if Penn State gets blown out? What if Penn State loses a close game? How about this what if? What if Penn State beats Oregon? That's a more fun what if to talk about. It is. Do they leap a victorious Texas? Texas is playing Georgia in the SEC championship game. Do they get the true number one seed and have an easier path to the final, including a bye week? Do they have extra time to prepare for the first playoff game? Get some injured players on the bubble healthy to come back for that first playoff game? Does it redeem Franklin and the sour loss to the Buckeyes? Does Penn State get respect that they would deserve by knocking off the number one team? I'd love to ponder those what ifs. Look, I love the optimism, Brian, and I love the approach, and I understand the feeling of being overwhelmed as well with some of the negative what ifs that we've discussed in not just the past few days, but there was really a conversation going on within like multiple college fan bases of teams that are in contention for conference championship games, but also coaches. Lane Kiffin talked about it, and You have the talking heads and everything on ESPN talking about it. The want to or the need to play for a conference championship, and the fear really of like, what if you lose, and how does that affect your CFP standing? Which is why we've written about it and talked about it, because it is something that we get asked about a lot. I mean, I shouldn't say all the messages after the Maryland game, but a lot of them that I got were in reference to what happens if Penn State loses to Oregon. And so, but looking at the positive side of it, I think there's a very real chance Penn State would be that number one overall seed if they beat Oregon. I mean, you would beat the number one team in the country. You would beat the team that beat you, because Oregon, outlasted Ohio State, a couple months back. Texas would certainly have a claim if they beat Georgia, though, because then they would be avenging their only loss of the season. I was there in Austin when Texas got beat by Georgia, and it was pretty comprehensive. Losing 30-15, some turnovers in that game. Texas just looked totally out of sorts. So if they came back and they won the SEC title game by beating the only team that beat them, I would think that Texas would be number one, but at the same time, Penn State would certainly have a case. They would certainly have a case, especially if Penn State comes out and wins by double digits, which I'm not expecting. Again, I think this is a close one-score game either way, but certainly an opportunity for that in terms of the number one seed. And I'm not sure if it would help too much in terms of guys currently injured on Penn State. I mean, there are a couple lingering deals there, but I mean, for the most part, the guys we know who are hurt, they're dealing with long-term injuries and considered season-ending injuries. But we talk about Nick Singleton being healthy now. After dealing with bumps and bruises throughout the Big Ten slate after taking a beating against Illinois. Like, I'm sure he would love a week off just to sit in the ice tub and be all right there. You talk Harrison Wallace, who didn't play against Maryland, and I would think he's going to give it a go in the Big Ten championship game. But even if he's hampered by something, if he's bothered by something, that extra time off would certainly help. Where I think it helps immensely more is just the path that Penn State would have, not having to play a first round game. And I get it. Some people have argued, oh, it's better to be the 5 seed than the 1 seed. You play, a G5 team or the Big 12 champ, and then you play, Boise or whatever. I think it's overlooked how much playing an extra game matters, like in terms of just the health and these are college kids. A lot of them, or I shouldn't say a lot of them, but a good crop of them on Penn State's team, and a lot of these other teams that are going to be contending for the national title are going to be going to the NFL and playing 17-game seasons in a year or two. But I think Penn State would love that bye. I really think they would love that bye. And then you take whoever you would play, in the quarterfinal. And then last bit of that Mr. Hopeful statement, in terms of redeeming Franklin and the sour loss to Ohio State, of course it would. Of course it would. If Penn State were to come out and beat the number 1 team in the country and win the Big Ten championship, like it's like Dumb and Dumber, like totally redeem yourself. Like, I get that there might be some lingering frustrations and annoyances over how that Ohio State game went. Tyler Warren should have got the ball at the goal line. We all agree with that. But if James Franklin were to rally this team, and not just him, because it's the leaders on the team, it's the assistant coaches week in, week out, it's the senior leaders, it's the juniors who have stepped up from a leadership standpoint. I wrote about it after the game against Maryland about, they talked after the Ohio State loss about not letting one loss turn into 2 or 3. And we've heard that before, 2017, 2018. We heard about that before. And those Penn State teams weren't able to refocus and win out and put themselves in a position to, at the time, get into the 14 playoff. They did that this year. They did that. Now, granted, the competition is a little, I think, less than maybe what they faced in 17 and 18 after the Ohio State loss. But to go and destroy Washington, everyone destroys Purdue, to win in a really gritty way at Minnesota, and then for all intents and purposes, everyone in the stadium knew that all you have to do is beat Maryland, and they went out and beat them to a pulp. Like, I think that says a lot about this team, about how Franklin has constructed this team from both a talent standpoint, from a mental standpoint. If they were able to go out and beat Oregon, I think that would shift the narrative in a big way in a big way about big game James. Last question, and this is from Mike, and going off that with James Franklin, wondering who Coach James Franklin goes after at offensive coordinator if Kotelnicki leaves. Moorhead? Question mark. And again, that's from Mike. And look, I think it's a little too early to talk about possible offensive coordinator replacements. For anyone who missed it, a West Virginia beat writer reported over the weekend that Andy Kotelnicki expects to interview for the West Virginia job after the Mountaineers fired Neil Brown after 6 years at the helm. I think his overall record was a couple games above 500. They never cracked the top 25. They're looking for a spark down there in Morgantown. So I get why West Virginia would want to interview Kotelnicki if that's the case. And they saw week one. Penn State's offense put up a crazy amount of yards and 34 points in a season-opening win. And I would understand why Kotelnicki would, at the very least, want to get the experience of interviewing for a head coaching job. This is his first year as an offensive coordinator at a program like Penn State, at a program of that level. He was with Lance Leipold at Wisconsin Whitewater, at Buffalo, at Kansas, became a really hot name when he was at Buffalo, into that job at Kansas and what he did with Jalen Daniels and Devin Neal and everyone there. But this is a much bigger stage for him. And I understand if any coach wanted to interview for a job or capitalize, on being a reason why, Penn State's offense, which looked so dull and so uninspired last year, a big reason why Penn State's in this Big Ten championship game is because of how Andy Kotelnicki, helped develop Drew Aller and how he has utilized Tyler Warren. I mean, Tyler Warren, a tight end, is in the conversation to be invited to New York for the Heisman Trophy ceremony. And it's the way that Tyler has been used that has helped him get to that point. And that's all Andy Kotelnicki. But I don't know if that's the move that Kotelnicki would only make after 1 year at Penn State. It took Franklin a lot to get him here in the first place. He was comfortable at Kansas. He had a great contract. Like I said, he had worked with Lance Leipold for the longest time. So it took a lot to get him to Happy Valley in the first place. Coordinators who are wired the way Andy Kotelnicki is, they're confident. They're confident in their players. They're confident in their system. And they're confident in themselves. And like West Virginia, I'm not saying it's a bad job by any means. But when you look at the current landscape of college football, those top two conferences, the Big Ten, the SEC, those jobs are going to be coveted more than anything else in the sport. And I think Andy Kotelnicki could hold out. I think he could hold out if we get to the point where he's offered a job like West Virginia or just another job, right, in the Big 12 or the ACC, a G5 job, a good G5 job. I think he could hold out. Maybe he's got some pieces to work with next year at quarterback. If Drew Aller decides to come back, I know he's an NFL draft prospect right now, but might be beneficial for him to come back and develop more under Kotelnicki. That could be a big deal as well. So just something to consider. Moorhead was thrown in there. Yeah, I mean, he's a Pittsburgh guy. He's at Akron right now. It's not necessarily his fault that they're not playing all too well. I mean, Akron is a really, really tough place to win. And Penn State knows what it would get in Moorhead. And I personally like the guy. I liked covering him. So if Kotelnicki were to leave and Moorhead were to hop on, I'd be down with that. We know that he's good with the media. He's good. He's just a good guy, honestly. And he knows what he's doing in terms of offensive play calling. But we'll see. Just something to keep an eye on. I appreciate the question. I appreciate all the questions. I mean, these subscriber mailbag podcasts are always fun to do. Feels a little weird not having Max here to bounce ideas off of, but he's working tirelessly in preparation for signing day on Wednesday. Again, keep tabs on PennLive.com. As we push forward into signing day, a lot of content to come there. Like I mentioned at the top of the podcast, another podcast to come, recapping signing day with Bob and Max. And then me and Bob will be back later this week to preview in depth the Big Ten championship game between Penn State and Oregon. For Johnny McGonigal, it's a Blue White Breakdown presented by Penn Live.